Welcome back to Inside the GMAT. I'm your host, Zach. Today's episode is all about building your career-defining narrative, whether you're just starting your MBA or master's application or thinking about your long-term career. That narrative that you craft can make all the difference, not just in getting into a top program, but in building a brand that resonates throughout your entire life. And joining me to break it all down is someone who's built her own career around helping people do exactly that. Ellin Lolis is the founder and president of Ellin Lolis Consulting. Great name, 10 out of 10, where she spent more than a decade helping applicants get into the world's most competitive MBA programs. She's an award-winning writer, a certified career coach, and a true expert in strategic storytelling, and now an Inside the GMAT podcast guest. Ellin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Zach. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
So, in your work, you talk about the importance of a career-defining narrative. What is that, and why does it matter?
Yeah, so I always like to start with why is storytelling important? So I'm going to take a little bit of a step back. I work a lot with engineers, consultants, people that work on Wall Street. And one of the things that we notice is that they often prioritize the quant, right? I'm really technical. I've got all these math skills, and that's great. But our brains are not really wired that way. Our brains are wired for story. So if you think about when you're meeting somebody for the first time, you don't say, I delivered these results and increased company profits by 20%. You say, yeah, one time I went to Mexico too, and we had this great trip. And oh my gosh, you went there too. How did you like it? You trade stories, and that's how you bond with people. And stories are really a great way for us to kind of hack that system within our brains to build connection and really build clarity with other people. And that's why, Netflix is so enjoyable to watch. We love, watching stories. So when we think about narrative, it's really a narrative is just another way of saying, a story. I think a lot of people benefit from thinking about their career narrative for two reasons. The first is that when you think about a career narrative, it makes it a lot easier to express that value to other people. So here's what I'm good at. Here's where I'm going. Here's the impact that I want to make. And when you come across somebody who knows that really, really clearly and who can express it well, it just makes so much more of an impact because you say, that's someone I want to invest in. They're clear, they're driven, they know where they're going. Yes, let's get behind that person. And, it can also make it a lot easier to do things like get promotions and move up the corporate ladder because you're used to advocating for yourself. You're used to sharing that narrative. But I think on the other end, it's also really beneficial for us as people because a lot of times we're so focused on just checking those boxes, right? This week, it's Monday, I have all these things to do. I have to answer all these emails and then I have to go pick up my kids or do this or do that. And we get kind of lost in the day-to-day and we lose sight of that overarching narrative of where we want to be. So what would my Wikipedia page look like at the end of my career? Or what kind of impact would I want to sit back and say? Or what kind of stories would I want to tell my grandkids about my life? So I think sitting down, especially earlier on in your career, and of course revisiting it, but thinking about what is that defining career narrative for me? What is that impact that I want to make? What are those steps that I want to take? What kind of person do I want to be within my career more than just, someday I want to get promoted? I think is so powerful because it helps us stay on track and serves as something that we can continue to check back in with ourselves and make sure that we're staying aligned with that purpose, or whenever we feel like we need to change and adjust track.
So applying that to the business school journey, how do admissions committees evaluate that narrative? I mean, there's so much in there that is subjective and experience-based. No two narratives are probably alike.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one thing when it comes to business school admissions is clarity, because what we're looking at is a lot of times the schools get somewhere around, 8,000 to 10,000 applications per year. So if you're really looking, how can I narrow this down quickly? Unfortunately, there's no way to spend an hour on each of those applications. It's just impossible. So we're going through a triage, really, really quick triage to see, is it worth investing more time or is it not? So the number one thing in your narrative when you're looking at business school is clarity. We want to see, I have a very clear short-term goal post-MBA. I have a very clear long-term goal that I'm pursuing, a very clear impact that I want to make with these goals, and these connect with what I've done before. So your narrative needs to hit all of those points. And then, of course, how does the MBA help me reach those goals? So we want to think about past, MBA, and then your goals, and how does that all tie together? So for example, if I've worked my entire life in, let's say, green finance, and then all of a sudden I say post-MBA, I want to open a hospital. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? It's going to be very confusing. Maybe there's some sort of story there that explains it. Maybe your family has a large, healthcare conglomerate and you want to take over and found a hospital. So, okay, there could be a story there, but without some sort of narrative that explains those steps, it's just going to seem confusing, poorly thought out. Maybe you really haven't put in a lot of effort into this, and it's a really good reason just to discard it. I always try to tell people, think about how much time you spend going through a video on TikTok. Our brains are really kind of wired that way now, that if it's not immediately clear, immediately engaging, we kind of scroll past. And I think with admissions, as much as we try, our brains are, we bring that same brain a little bit to that as well. So if there's a really easy reason to discard it, there's an unclear narrative, it's a really good reason just to say, maybe this person just needs more time to figure it out. Good luck. So that number one thing is going to be clarity. And the second thing is going to be passion, right? It's so different when you're talking to someone who has passion about their career and with somebody who doesn't. So bringing that passion, showing the impact, showing why you want to do this, how it could potentially, make the world a better place is really interesting. And when I say make the world a better place, not every goal has to, save people or be that kind of, let's say, stereotypical impact. Maybe your job in finance is enhancing the entrepreneurial ecosystem in your country. And that's going to create a lot of small businesses that are going to help a lot of families have income that they wouldn't have otherwise. That's really important. It doesn't necessarily have to be, saving children in low-income regions. So really thinking about that passion and bringing passion and clarity to the forefront and making sure that all of those points align. And of course, making sure that the MBA is presented as an integral part of that is really, really essential.
I'm really glad we're talking about this before we get into the nitty-gritty of how to craft this career narrative, because I think a lot of folks go into this process thinking, how am I going to impress admissions professionals? And they put their story or their passion secondary or tertiary to this feeling like I need to be super impressive. I need to brag. I need to tell them what I think they want to hear. When in reality, that's probably one of the biggest misconceptions or missteps that applicants take, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this whole idea of I'm going to tell them what I think they want to hear is a huge mistake. First of all, you don't know what they want to hear. So it's really hard to get that right. Second of all, they don't want, I was actually talking to a client about this the other day, and they said, I know that I've built my entire career in the food industry, and my goal is to transition to that in a different region because I'm really passionate about it. And, long term, I want to come back and work with, the children's food sector in my country, but it's really, really underdeveloped. Whereas in, the US, it's much more developed. And so I can learn a lot and come back and bring that. But I'm really worried that the number one post-MBA recruitment area at that school is consulting. And if I don't tell them that I want to go into consulting, I'm not going to get admitted. And we were talking about, first of all, this goal makes a lot of sense for you, right? It checks all the points. You're passionate about food. You've built an entire career around food. So yes, of course, this is what you want to do. But on the other hand, they don't want a class just full of consultants. They want to have diversity. It's not consultant school, it's business school, right? And it's not finance school, it's business school. They want to have a wide perspective, a wide variety of perspectives represented. So it's really important that people stay true to the narrative that makes sense for them. On the other hand, I will caution people, and this is something that you should think of before you start applying for an MBA, is if you can't find a way to make that narrative make sense for an MBA application, maybe an MBA doesn't make sense for you. For example, if you want to be a professor, your ultimate goal and only goal is to be a professor, maybe, and depending on the area, maybe an MBA is not the best thing for you. It might make sense. It might be complementary, but generally speaking, an MBA is not a way to, tenureship at a top university. Usually there's other ways to that. So, thinking about, does an MBA really make sense? And if you have to change your story so much to make it make sense, but that's not really what you want to end up doing, maybe have a good think about if this is the right path.
So let's say that somebody knows for sure that they want to get their MBA or maybe even a business master's. Where does one even start when they're trying to build their narrative? Is there a methodology that you utilize?
Yeah, so I use two exercises together that I've spent the last, 10 plus years working on and tinkering with and fine tuning. And the first is what we call a goals planning exercise. And there's a couple different steps that go into this. The first thing that I really like to encourage people to think about is what is your short term and what is your long term? Because those need to make sense with each other. So if you say, short term, I want to work in sustainability investment, and long term, I want to work in consumer goods focused on increasing shade range in cosmetics or something like that. How does one get you to the next, right? So it's really important to make sure number one, that all of those points connect, because I think you need a good outline. You need good bullet points and then kind of go from there. Then what we like to do is add a layer of, why does this matter to you? If you can't articulate why you want to do these goals, I don't think your story is going to be very good. So you need to be able to articulate, here's what I want to do. Here's why I'm so passionate about it, and kind of go from there. And then how are your goals going to make an impact in the world? And then you're going to I have my clients condense that into what we call a goals paragraph. And that's nothing more than just 150 word kind of statement of, here's my goals, here's my statement. So short term, I want to do this in this industry. Here's ideally a job title. Here's why I want to do it. And then here is the impact that it's going to make. That's then going to prepare me to reach this long-term goal, again, job title, industry, and here's why I want to do that, and here's the ultimate impact that I want to make. I think having that in a very clear, condensed format is really, really helpful, because that's going to serve as kind of your North Star for the rest of your application. Plus, in your essays, you're going to write not 100, but a lot of goals essays throughout the process, and you can just kind of drop that paragraph in here and there. So it's work that's well worth doing. I then like to have them do an exercise that I like to call kind of the aha moment. So thinking about, what's the moment in your life that made you realize that this is what you want to do? That might be a personal story. That might be a project that you worked on. That might be a conversation that you had. But what was that moment where kind of the light bulb went off and you said, this is it. Sustainability is for me, or healthcare is for me, or education is for me? Because I think that can sometimes help you. If you don't have one, that can be kind of maybe a red flag that maybe you should be thinking a little bit more. Maybe these aren't exactly the right goals for you, but also it really allows us to add that extra level of storytelling depth when it comes to building your application, because your goals don't exist in a vacuum, right? They exist within a larger narrative that we're going to present within the essays or the interviews. If they say, what are your goals and, why are you pursuing these goals? You want to be able to share a story, or what are your goals and why Wharton in an essay? Usually we start with a story and then get into your goals and then talk about why Wharton. We want to have some sort of moment that we can bring to the table where this all clicked for you. And then finally, as part of that goals exercise, I like to make them justify, here are multiple things within my life or career that back up that these are the right goals for me. Because you can have great goals that you're really, really passionate about, but if you can't show me that they make sense for you, and this is not necessarily for your career, I would say in life, this is very much for business school. If you can't prove that you're going to be successful in pursuing these, again, that might be a little bit of a red flag. They're really concerned about recruitment in the MBA. They really want to get you a good job. They want to help you take your career to the next level. That's really kind of the main objective. Building your network and, classes are also very important, but the career focus is really paramount. So if you're not able to show that a recruiter is going to look at your profile and say, yes, this is the person for the job, we might have some problems here. So I like to really have people detail out, here's some examples that I can show to prove that these are the right goals for me. So that's the first exercise that we do, which is the goals planning. Then I like to do a personal branding exercise. And this is, how can we add that extra layer on top of this? Because I think for business school, the career is going to serve as your foundation. But most of the people that are applying for business school have great careers and are able to articulate to a certain extent why they want to do this and all these points that I just talked about. Harvard came out at some point and said about 80% of applicants that they receive, or applications that they receive, are perfectly qualified and would make great admits. So how do you take, 8,000 people down to 1,000? It's all of that extra information and showing how you can contribute to the unique diversity of the class. So that's where this personal brand comes in. It allows us to explore so many different things about your life, whether that's your extracurricular activities or what your passions are or childhood experiences that you've had, to really add that extra level of depth. But of course, we're always looking for consistency as well. I think the hardest part about the business school process is not saying everything that you've ever done and everything that you're ever passionate about, but really taking all of that and then creating a very clear positioning, a very clear narrative that's multifaceted, but that you're not saying, I did this and I did that and I did this and I did that, because it doesn't come across as very thoughtful or very well planned out. So that second exercise of the personal brand allows us to add that depth and then create a very cohesive narrative, a very cohesive brand that's going to be multifaceted, but also clear and cohesive to bring throughout the entire application.
I really love this idea of the aha moment, because I think no matter what job you have, what type of career you have, there's always an aha moment if you think about it. But does this look different for somebody who maybe doesn't have a this and that and this and that to draw from to call into like the perfect goals paragraph or personal branding statement?
First of all, I don't think there's anything as a perfect, and I want to say that because I think a lot of people that I talk to are so stressed that they're not perfect, that they don't apply. So for anyone listening, you don't have to have the perfect goals paragraph to go to Harvard. You just have to have one that makes a lot of sense for you. So don't stress if it's not perfect. If you're really still kind of at the beginning part of your career, maybe you don't have the background to really be able to go into a leadership class and be like, yeah, I've seen that. You can bring this perspective and let's learn a little bit more about how to kind of advance that. That's not to say that it's a non-starter, but I would say if you've got a year or two of experience, maybe consider a master's of management. Those are more designed towards early career professionals, or maybe wait a little bit. But the majority of people that we've worked with that are in that boat that they're applying kind of young are generally people that work in really fast moving industries. So they say, yeah, I've worked in a startup for a year and a half and it feels like 5. And you look at all the things they've done, you say, wow, yeah. Because you really need enough to be able to show that you've already got a strong track record of success when you're applying. If you've only got one good story, that's just not going to be enough to sustain a good application. Even if you've got a really clear kind of vision of where you want to go, you need to have a couple of different things that say, I've achieved a lot of different things. I'm able to show different facets, that I've got good communication skills, that I've got good quant skills. So if you've really only got one key story, I would really, really suggest waiting. And going through this exercise can be good because I think if you realize maybe I don't have this, maybe a year or two, not only would help you be more competitive, but I honestly think that that exists to make sure that you take the most from the MBA.
You alluded to this a little bit earlier, but how does one customize their goals and, passions and aha moments for possibly dozens, maybe not hundreds of essays when they're applying to business school?
Yeah, I think that's the art. And that's where I think sometimes having someone like me can help, because we've done it a lot of different times. We know, okay, do this is going to work great here. Not to say that that if you don't have an admissions consultant, you can't do that. You absolutely can. But what I like to say is, you're probably not going to need a different story for every prompt for every school. You probably need, 5 or 6 really good stories, and then you're going to build on top of that. And you're going to keep that. I'm not saying you should copy and paste your essays because that doesn't usually work super well. But for example, a goals essay, a lot of times what we'll do is start with that context, right? So that can either be the aha moment, especially if it's a more kind of personal motivation, or very often that's some sort of career win or project that's related. For example, if you work with fintech, it could be, and you want to work with, providing more access to credit to small and medium businesses. Maybe it's an example where you worked with this fintech, you started to expand credit, and that made you realize that what you really want to do is continue working with this, but on a larger scale, to simplify it a lot. That kind of narrative you can repeat over and over because that makes a lot of sense. I did this, it made me realize this, and that's why these are my goals. You don't need to reinvent the wheel for every essay, for every different school. So anytime you see a goals essay, you can kind of use that base startup. You might want to change the intro. You might want to change the language a little bit to show different characteristics and fit for the school. You might need to shorten it or lengthen it depending on the word count. But the basic principle isn't going to change. And for example, a lot of times we encourage people to talk about their extracurricular activities, the volunteer work that they've done, mentorship, helping others. It's great to be able to show that you have a strong track record of giving back, of helping other people. So you're not going to probably need to talk about one experience, a different experience for every essay. You're probably going to have 2 or 3 that are, these are my really best stories, and be able to use those stories, of course, customized to each school for each different essay. Across how you use those within each essay, you need to be really strategic. And you can visit our website, ellinlolis.com. We have a lot of guides on each school that says, maybe choose these kinds of stories here. So for each school, we really break it down. I think sometimes that can be helpful just because it can give you a good starting point of maybe use a mix of personal and professional, or we really think professional works better here. We really think personal works better here, or choose something here that's going to show how you think outside the box because this school tends to value that in particular. And so really thinking about kind of the package that you're going to put together and your best stories, and being very thoughtful about how you mesh those two together.
I'm curious, perhaps as somebody who's taken a lot of L's in his career, are there ever any times where sharing, the things you learned from failure are more impressive in an essay question than talking about a win?
Yes. I would say, though, it needs to be done strategically, and you need to think about the school. And again, I think that's where kind of having access to guides and things like that can be helpful. For example, Stanford, they have their famous "What matters most to you and why." And being very vulnerable in that question and talking about, losses that you've had or challenges that you face that maybe didn't go to plan and what you learned from them and how you grew from them can be a really great narrative. Some schools directly ask, tell us about a failure and what you learned from it. Great, go for it. But when you have a really limited amount of space, some schools ask, maybe 2 essay questions. I would choose your wins just because, you really want to show I'm on a track record of success. Things are going really well for me. My stock is up. I'm a good buy. So I would say that you really need to kind of calibrate that based on the school, what they're looking for, the essay question. You will want to have those ready for the interview because that is a very common interview question about a setback, a failure, a disappointment, because we do want to see people who are resilient, but we also want to see people who are able to be self-aware. Because if you talk to somebody and you say, tell me about a time you failed, and they say, I've never failed. So that doesn't look good. So you need to have some of those stories ready, but considering a lot of times you're going to have very limited space, I would focus on primarily your wins unless there's a really compelling reason to choose otherwise, or the question directly asks it.
What about some other setbacks that somebody maybe has encountered in their career, like maybe some gaps on their resume due to layoffs, or they had to take some time off, or maybe they had a low GPA, or they've pivoted careers? How does someone address these more uncommon or perhaps in this day and age, pretty common aspects in their career narrative?
Yeah, so I would say most of these are going to be addressed in the optional essay. So that's that essay that they say, is there anything else that you'd like to share? So things like low GPA or a low GMAT score or a big career break are typically going to go in that essay because that's where you can just kind of simplify it and justify it, talk about your wins in the other parts of the essay. In that case, you want to be able to counterbalance it. So if you've got a low GPA, try to get a good GMAT score. If you've got a career gap, then try to make sure you're not currently on that career gap. It can be the case, but generally speaking, it's always good to have a resolution to that and show that, I faced this challenge, I overcame it. And that's kind of the general narrative. But you also want to give context. I think a lot of times people are scared to give context because they feel like it might come across as making excuses or things like that. If you've got a low GPA, but it's because you were really involved in a lot of things, this typically happens more kind of outside the US where GPA might not necessarily be as valued as within the US. Like a lot of people work full-time jobs because that's really what helps you get that college job much more than your GPA or, kind of your college track record. So they'll just be really honest and say, listen, I was working 40 hours a week. Should I have prioritized my studies a little bit more? Probably yes. Now I have the maturity to know that, but it's not an accurate reflection of my academic potential. I got this GMAT score. I work at this really highly quantitative job. I do really well. I've been early promoted. So kind of counterbalancing that. In terms of career pivots, that's a really interesting question because I would say that's something that I would not always leave for the optional essay. I would sometimes put that in the goals essay or somewhere else because the motivations behind that need to be really clear. Why did you make these shifts? How is it helping you reach this bigger goal? I think, within a goals essay, that's really important for us to understand. So if you switched from finance to education, why? We want to know. So explain that to us and then show that it's been successful and that you love it and that you've made this great pivot and that's going to continue to help you reach further goals that you have in your career.
Does your career narrative change after you get accepted to your MBA, after you graduate from your MBA?
Yeah, I like to think about the career narrative as being something very dynamic and something that you can continue to come back to. So a lot of people get to the MBA with a pretty good idea of what they want to do, but then it's kind of like going to college too. You realize that there's so much more out there that you never knew about, or maybe you meet this person who has this amazing idea for a startup and you guys are perfectly suited to found this together. Never in a million years could you have imagined you'd be a startup founder in this area. So I think a career narrative needs to kind of serve as a North Star, but needs to be flexible because your life is going to change. Nobody maybe a couple people, but very few people 20 years ago thought they'd be working with something like AI. And now look how many people are working with that. So, your career narrative is going to shift, but I think it's important to continue to revisit that. Maybe you have a check-in with yourself once a year, put it on your calendar and say, every July 1st, I'm going to check in with myself about my career narrative. Where do I want to go? What are my short-term goals for myself? What are my 5-year goals? What are my 10-year goals? And maybe it's a little bit less when I have this specific job like it was in your business school application. Maybe those long-term goals are a little bit more about, I want to be working in education and do something that I really believe in. You've got the next 10 years to figure out exactly what that looks like. I think the more specific you can be, the better. But if you can't, that's also fine. But I think it's important to continue to check in with yourself, because what can happen is you graduate from business school, you get back into that, flow of, okay, I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to pay off my student loans, I've got to move up the corporate ladder, I'm getting married now, and all of these things are happening. And so you kind of forget to continue to check in with yourself, and you get into kind of that same rut of not really having a sense of where you want to end up. And I think continuing to check in with yourself and say, am I on the right track? Is this really what I want to be doing? Am I living my purpose? Am I living my vision? Is such a powerful exercise. And maybe you check in with yourself every 3 months or every 2 years. For everybody that's going to look a little different, but your life is going to change. Your priorities are going to change. The industries you're in are going to change. The options are going to change. So it's really important to keep revisiting that.
What are some tips that you have for evolving your career narrative over time? Because I imagine that as we grow, we change, our values change, etc., that the narrative changes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that you can do is think about, I love this exercise of, if they're going to write a Wikipedia page about me, what would I want to be on it? Because I feel like that's kind of universal. And no matter where you're at in your career, that's a very easy thing to visualize, right? I want them to say this and I want them to say that. And I know for me, what I wanted 10 years ago was very different than what I want today, right? In terms of things like, work-life balance, or, the kind of projects that I want to work on, or doing podcasts like this. 10 years ago, I wasn't really thinking about that, but now I love doing it. I think it's really, really fun and great to share this kind of information with people in a platform I never thought about before. So I think thinking about what your Wikipedia page would look like and updating your Wikipedia page can be a nice way to do that. And also I think about more practical things as well. I don't think it's unreasonable to think about how personal or family goals play into that, right? If you want to start a family, maybe you want to scale back a little bit, or maybe your partner just got a new job in another country and all of a sudden you're looking at career opportunities that you never imagined. So I think that the personal aspect needs to come into play there. But I think it always comes back to, what do I want to achieve with my career? What are my values? And I think, honestly, what makes you happy? Because what makes you happy also changes with time. I think at the beginning of our careers, sometimes maybe we have a little more energy to, work until 2 a.m. Maybe when we're 40, we don't want to do that anymore. But also, the kind of things that motivate us. Maybe earning a really, really high salary is the number one priority that you have at the beginning of your career. And then I work with a lot of executive MBAs applicants who are already at quite a high level. They're in their early 40s and they say, listen, I've made enough money that I could stop working today and never worry again, but I'm not happy. I'm not fulfilled. And now I really want to focus on fulfillment. So the goal that person had, when they were just starting their career is not invalid anymore. That was very important to them and they achieved that goal. Great. But now they have a very different goal. So they need to evolve their career narrative. And I think really being self-aware and checking in with yourself and understanding, what do I want out of my career? And what do I hope to achieve? This is what I'm spending all day doing. What do I hope to get from it? I think for everyone, that career narrative is going to look a little bit different. So defining what those principles are for you and always coming back to update them, and thinking about what matters to me most right now and what is really going to make me feel fulfilled and happy is a great way to kind of check in with yourself.
So before we go, I just have a couple, let's call them rapid fire questions for you, Ellin. What is one MBA essay prompt that you absolutely love?
This is going to make a lot of people upset, but I really like NYU's Pick 6 because a lot of people don't like, it's a picture essay. And so you pick 6 photos and you give captions about honestly anything. So you write kind of an introduction, a 3-sentence introduction, and then you write a caption for each of your 6 photos. I love seeing that essay because we see a lot of goals essays and they're really, really important. It's important to check motivations, but seeing that creativity, everyone has a different format. You get to see what they care about, their families, their dogs, their vacations, their volunteer work. I love that essay. I know a lot of people don't like it because they really struggle with photos or they feel like they have to be creative and they're not a creative kind of person. So they struggle a lot with that essay, but I love that essay. It's one of my favorites. I hope they never get rid of it. It's kind of related with, I say, Duke's 25 random things about you, where you can add a couple photos if you'd want, but it's just 25 fun facts about yourself. I also love that essay. I just really like seeing the photos.
What is the most surprising thing that MBA programs don't actually care about?
What you think they care about. I think that people think that there is a one specific profile and I have to say the perfect thing because they're looking for one specific thing. And I think that they're looking for diversity within the class. They don't just want a bunch of investment bankers and consultants. They want people who have varied life experiences, varied career experiences. So I think people think that they want a very narrow kind of profile. We worked with a nuclear submarine scientist. We've worked with someone who was a runner-up for Miss America. We've worked with influencers. We've worked with people from all walks of life who go to an MBA and are very successful. Reverends in churches, things like, honestly, everything you can imagine. And those people thrive there and they're very interesting. If you think about being there and somebody talks about a leadership experience, we're having a crisis on my submarine dive. Like, wow, I am locked in. Tell me what happened. Versus, it was another presentation that the client didn't like. Not to say that those are not important. They are, but you hear that a little bit more often. So having that diversity in the class is very important to them. And I think people don't give that enough credit.
What is one trait you see in nearly every successful applicant?
Clarity, 100% clarity. If you don't know why you're doing this, don't do it yet. So if you can't articulate what your goals are, if you can't articulate how an MBA makes sense, if you can't articulate why you feel like you're the right person to be admitted to an MBA, and that last one can be hard. Maybe you need a little help, but especially if you can't articulate that kind of career part or how an MBA fits into it, maybe you would benefit from another year of thinking about it, of brainstorming, of really making sure, because it's a lot of money to spend on something that you're not sure about. But if you don't have that clarity, they're not going to go for it. You need to be able to say, I'm locked in. I know what I'm going to do from day one. I'm going to be using all of the resources to reach these goals.
People have started their MBA journey for the most part by this time of the year. What are some of your final thoughts for these folks who are early or midway into their application journey?
Yeah, so I would say if you're really early on, I guess this is kind of true for everyone, but especially if you're early on, really think about your timeline. I have a lot of clients who come and say, oh, we've got 8 months. I have so much time. And then all of a sudden there's 2 months and they're panicking and they're, oh my gosh, this is so hard. So I think, having a really good timeline and sticking to it is the number one best thing that you can do for yourself, especially when it comes to studying for GMAT. I think people underestimate how much time it's going to take. They think study for, a couple weeks and it'll be fine and I'll be good. And very rarely do I see that be the case. Usually it takes a little bit more time than people think to get the score that they want, because a lot of people are going to take the test more than once to get their target score, right? So having a good timeline that gives you enough time for a busy week at work that maybe you're not going to be able to do anything, or an extra GMAT attempt is really critical for your success. Otherwise, it's very easy for you to lose that timeline, and now it's actually next year or the next year, and now maybe you're too old for it, or it can kind of spiral. So having a really clear timeline, and if you're applying, it's August now, and if you're applying for the January, your timeline is critical. You've got just a few months. You need to be really, really detailed, and you need to stick to that timeline to make sure that you get everything done.
The second that our listeners turn off this podcast, what is the best first step that they should take to crafting their career narrative today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say if they are interested, you can sign up for one of our new resources. It's called My Admit Coach, and it's myadmitcoach.com. It's a platform that we created that uses AI together with all of these resources to help you brainstorm. I also turned myself into a clone, so you can talk to me anytime, any day on the platform. Wow. And kind of brainstorm that process. It also speaks multiple languages. So if you'd like to, well, I don't really, but my clone does. So if you'd like to brainstorm in your native language, you can do that as well. And I think that can be really helpful to go through that process, start to think about what are my goals, what's my brand, and then also brainstorming your essays, brainstorming your best stories. You can do that all in the platform. Or, if you'd like more kind of one-on-one support, you can reach out to us at ellinlolis.com, and we'd be happy to walk you through the entire process and provide you with that guidance throughout the way.
Did you ever expect to have a clone on your Wikipedia page?
No, I did not. Will she have her own Wikipedia page? Who knows?
Ellin, thank you so much for joining me today on Inside the GMAT.
Of course, it's been such a pleasure. And for everyone listening, thank you for your attention. Good luck with your application.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.